Amazon just announced that they're piloting robots for the home. 20 years ago, the number of jobs that existed that no longer exist today was about 1 in 3 jobs. And futurists predict that in another 20 years from now, another third of the jobs that exist today won't be here. They'll be replaced by robots or artificial intelligence or some other solution that doesn't involve a human being. But there's one thing that all futurists agree on, which is that the jobs of the future will be available to those people who are able to use their brains in a particular way. Because at least for now, computers have not yet caught up with the ability of the human brain to think, to plan, to process, and to make decisions, to communicate well, to enroll people into 401k plans, to do all of the things that many of you do, which is to support the performance of human beings. And so today I want to think deeply and carefully about what role wellness has to play in that kind of future, when what really matters is not the statement, our people are our most important asset, but instead the idea that our people's brain performance is our most important asset. And so for the next 2 or 3 hours, we're going to talk about how to train our brains and our employees' brains to fire on all cylinders, if you like that analogy, or to work optimally, not only in the way that people feel that it's working, but in sort of measurable, quantifiable ways that make a difference to the performance of your organization. Now, we all have a theory about how we make our brains work better. So before we get started, what I'd like you to do is open your workbooks and answer this question for me. In fact, I'm going to ask you to do 2 things. Open your workbook to the page where you get to answer this, and if you're not clear on which workbook it is, it's this one here. And if you open the very first page, I would like you to stand up, grab a pen from the middle of the table if you can't get one already, and for a couple of minutes, just think about, and while you're thinking, so I want you to see if your brain works while you can do something else. While you're thinking, assume a squat position and write down what you think are the top 5 things you can do to improve the way your brain or your employees' brains function. And if I see you popping up, that means that you're coming up for air or for thoughts, and then get back down and write it down. It's one way to make these quickly. I don't remember saying that when you're done, you can stand up. But thanks for assuming that. But who's completed? Okay. You're welcome to stay standing or take a seat while we fund this. By a show of hands, who had crossword puzzles? Or by a show of hands, brain training games? Okay. According to the research, the top 5 ways to improve your brain function, and I'm going to start in reverse order with the bonus, which is don't bang your head in an accident, because that can do serious damage and cause mild to severe cognitive impairment. But in order of the strength of which each of these things impacts your brain performance, number 1 is physical activity. Number 2, who had sleep quality or quantity? That's a pretty easy one. What's the relationship between 1 and 2? That's the way we usually think about it. As it turns out, the more we exercise, the better we're likely to sleep. Exercise produces sleep quantity and quality. So when we're feeling tired, what we try and do is go and sleep, when really we should go and exercise in order to rest better. Make sense? Number 3, who had chronic stress? Okay, just a few of you. We're going to dig stress quite a bit today because it is one of those things that creeps up on you and you think it affects how you feel. Maybe you feel it in your stomach, maybe you feel it in your head in the form of a headache, but you don't really think that it produces these terrible effects on performance. And perhaps more than anything else, chronic stress takes away from our performance. Who had mindfulness meditation or something like that? Awesome. And what's the connection between numbers 3 and number 4? Anybody? Mindfulness and meditation is one of the key ways to reduce or manage stress. So they're very related. And what's the connection between number 1 and number 3? Well, you should be getting the pattern by now. Exercise and mindfulness are 2 of the top ways to reduce and manage stress. And the 5th one is fostering social relationships. because our brain in people with whom we're connected as additional resources. So when we have people that are close to us at work, people on whom we can rely and who we trust, our brain assumes it's like we've got an extra pair of batteries or we've got an extra pair of resources. And when we feel like we have more resources versus the challenges that we face, stress, which is the gap between the two, reduces. Does that make sense? If you think about stress, it isn't something that's out in the world independent of how we feel. Stress is a conversation. And the conversation is, how big are my challenges and how capable do I feel of meeting them? The bigger that gap is, the more stressed we feel. Good luck trying to get people to remove the challenges in life because your boss and your clients aren't going anywhere. So the best thing you can do is to improve your capacity to cope. And exercise increases energy and the feeling of capacity, and so does having people around you who you feel like are team members that have your back. People say, research says that people experience companies in the following way. They join companies and they leave managers. And managers are perhaps one of the key social connections at work because they are the people that give you the feeling like you're psychologically safe. They support your efforts, they mentor you, you recognize and appreciate you if they're great managers. By a show of hands, who's ever had a terrible manager in their lives? Okay, keep your hand up if you still have one. Kidding. And of course, the fifth one is obvious. Try and avoid brain trauma. I was presenting with Dr. Arman, who's one of the leading psychiatrists in this area, and he was showing pictures last week of brains that have suffered trauma from football or from motor vehicle accidents versus healthy brains, and the damage is remarkable. So to the extent you can avoid banging your head against a wall in the face of having a bad manager, find another way to cope. Okay. So let's go to work on digging into each of these things a little bit, and these are the top 5, but they're not the only ones. So I want to share with you some of what we found in our research lab, Brat Lab, about the relationship between certain health habits and how our brains function. And to do that, I'm going to look at 4 elements of brain function. Well, they really have to do with 4 elements of performance. The first is stamina, so for how long you can work with full energy. And most of you, I think, do more than 6-hour days. Is that true? Yes? So stamina counts because in those last 2 hours of each day, if your energy flags, your performance drops. The second one is cognitive function, which is a combination of 2 things. Episodic memory, so how much you can keep in your brain with which you can process problems and challenges. And the other part of cognitive function is what's called executive function. You can think of it like the memory and the CPU in your computer, the computer now being your brain. If your memory, short-term or episodic memory, is terrible, well, you can't really keep information there to process. And if the processor itself, how you make decisions, isn't functioning, you'll make poor decisions. So that's why that one's important. Error rates is the third one. And just take for a moment, reflect on the occupation of the people that work for you. So the jobs you have. You may be running a clinic or a school or an oil and gas company or an insurance company. How important is error rates in the overall performance of your company? Because for some companies, it's life and death. You know, if nurses make a medication error, people die. In some companies, you can make an error, like if you're working for United Airlines on the call center, and you really are terrible to a customer like me 3 days ago. It's not a big deal. I'll just never fly them again. So by show of hands, for whom are errors massively important? Okay, the rest of you, it's up there, but it's not as critically important as how well someone's brain functions. And if you take all of those things together, in the research, there's something called units per man-hour, which is kind of self-explanatory. That's how much output you get per unit of time of the people that you have available. And of course, if there are more units produced per person, you can think of this in 2 ways. Either your productivity goes up, or you could have fewer people doing the same jobs. And so in this slide, we're having a look at the impact of healthy eating. And there's good news, which is, turns out Mom was right. Eating carrots and vegetables and eating healthily improves our brain function, and it does minimize the errors that we make. It doesn't have that much impact on stamina Although I'll note for many of us, when we feel like we're losing energy, what do we go to? Caffeine and sugar, both of which do give you a small performance boost. They do increase your stamina, but a tremendous cost over time. And units per man hour, that doesn't mean that healthy eating doesn't improve units per man hour. There's just no really good way to put a number on it. So it's included here. It wasn't in the top 5. So let's look at some things that were. Stress management. It may not surprise you that the biggest impact by far that comes from managing our stress is reducing error rates by up to a quarter. Now, if you're in healthcare services, can you imagine a more stressful job than working in an ER or serving patients whose life is in your hands? That's inherently stressful, and errors count. So you have an occupation there where two things are already working against each other. The job itself is fundamentally stressful, and that stress causes errors, which in some cases lead to life and death situations. So more so than any other profession, if you raised your hand earlier and said errors matter, stress management perhaps is one of the most critical habits you can go to work on. Here is the impact of tobacco. Now, I know that no one will answer this question. By a show of hands, who in the room smokes? Okay, that's wonderful. If you did, or if someone comes to you and says, I smoke, is there any benefit to doing so? One thing you should not tell them is, turns out as soon as you quit smoking, error rates increase. But if you look in the top right, only for about 4 weeks. And it increases because, like any drug, when you're in withdrawal, you get jittery and unfocused, and you're likely to make more errors. But within about 6 months, error rates plummet for non-smokers. So you may go through a little period where your smokers are making a few keyboard errors or a few medication errors in the worst case, but over time, by far, there's a benefit to reducing tobacco. Here is sleep. And if you've ever spent a night restlessly or not sleeping at all, you may have experienced yourself. Your brain just doesn't work that well. Or you feel that brain fog where you're at work and your brain's kind of working, you just feel that it's slowed down a little bit. And the consequence is big errors. And so getting enough and good quality sleep is one of the best ways to improve people's brain function. Last but not least is exercise, and you may notice that it is not top in each of these things, but across the board it has an impact, and more than anything else, it has an impact on stamina. And that's why when we're looking from a company's point of view about the habits that will produce the maximum increase in brain function, exercise comes at the top of the list because it gives us these extra 2 or 3 hours each day. NASA estimated that people that exercise for 30 minutes in the morning enjoy twice the stamina in the last 2 hours of each day. So if you've got about 10 people doing the same job that don't exercise, you pretty much are sending them home 2 hours early versus those people who did exercise. Or said differently, it makes economic sense for an employer to put in 20 minutes of exercise as part of the workday because you'd get it back 3 or 4 times over at the end of every single day. Make sense? Okay. Now here's the real issue, is half of people say that they are active. And of the half that say that they are, about a half of those are maybe making it up. Because we know that in the domain of health, people tend to overestimate how healthy they are, how healthily they eat, and how much they exercise. So depending on which statistics you look at, this is probably the most generous view. Some research papers say it's around about 15% of people that are active as defined by the requirements, or not the requirements, the recommendations that are set forth, 150 minutes of exercise a week. So if this is the state of play, we have an extraordinary opportunity. If we could get half, or maybe 70 or 80% of our people who are inactive to spend 5 or 10 or 15 minutes a day, doesn't have to be half an hour, doing some kind of vigorous exercise, we would enjoy all of those benefits in terms of increased stamina, reduced error rates, improved executive function, and total output for our companies. Now, by a show of hands, how many of you work for a company where productivity is not an issue? Not an issue? Just checking. Okay, so it's a number one issue for all of us, particularly in this state, where we have high costs of employment, high healthcare costs. The amount we produce per person matters critically here. So let's think about how this shows up in your particular jobs. And I want to start with the subject of cognitive function. Now, I'm going to show you a few things now that I really want you to pay attention to, and they require your brain to be fully engaged. Now, I know that we do these exercises quite often during these Alaska Wellness Academies, but we don't often do them to this extent. But what I wanted you to get a feel of is the quantity that is enough to have an impact on cognitive function. What you've just done, if you were to do that before you went to work on any particular task that you face, is number one, an aid for your memory retention. Intense, short bursts of exercise improve 1 week delayed memory retention by 10%. Doesn't sound terribly much, but it's quite an increase considering how little we remember 1 week later of any kind of conversation we have. But why I think you should care more is this graph here, which takes a little bit of explaining. Now, this talks about how many moves it takes you to execute on a task that requires some kind of planning. So before I explain this, I'd like you to take a moment and find someone next to you, pick a partner, and if there's an odd number at your table, go into threes. And before you share, think about a task that you have that's part of your job that requires a fair amount of planning. Now, you have to plan 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 steps ahead. It's something that you do that's pretty complicated. Share that with the person next to you when you've thought of it and have them do the same back so you have some context for this graph. Do that now, please. Raise your hands if you've had a chance to share. All done? Okay. Something in mind now, a complicated task that requires multiple steps in planning. Here's the impact if you had done that same little exercise circuit that we did before taking on a task like you've just brought to mind versus if you did no exercise. This study looked at groups of people who were taking on planning tasks, and they tasks at 4 different times. Firstly, there were 2 groups, people who were going to exercise and people who weren't going to exercise. Now, before they did it, they performed equally well, and it took them about 35 moves to execute. So this was a complex task. Think about it like solving a Rubik's Cube. It took 35 individual steps. Immediately after exercising, well, the control group, the people who didn't exercise, got a little bit better. As you do, if you do the same task over and over, you get better over time. But look at how drastically improved the group was that exercised. They more than halved the number of steps that it took them to complete the task. And their performance remained that good for the balance of the 30 minutes and 60 minutes afterwards. While everyone else, they improved, of course, and it took them an hour to catch up. So what does this mean? If you are facing something really stressful that takes lots of steps to get right, and there are lots of moving parts, and you've all got some idea of that because you just brought it to mind. If you took 2 or 3 minutes to do the kind of exercise we did and then went to work on it, you'd likely finish in half the time versus if you didn't. So the irony always is companies say, well, we don't have time to let people off the line to go and exercise, or we don't have time to exercise. By a show of hands, who's ever used the excuse, I don't have time to exercise? Okay, if you don't have your hands up, you're lying. What it's telling us is if you take the time or make the time to do little bits of exercise, it buys you back roughly 30 minutes for every 2 or 3 that you put in, if your job involves complicated tasks. So there's an element of stamina in there, but this is mostly about executive function. Our brain just figures things out, like complex chess games, better when it's filled with blood and nutrients. Our brains consume 25% of the oxygen we breathe, 20% of the glucose that we produce by what we eat. It is the most hungry organ in our bodies. Now, when it comes to making quality decisions, there are 2 types of decisions that we can make. Think about all the different decisions that you face in a day. You make in an instant. Have you ever made a gut instinct decision where something's complicated and you just say, I'm going to go with my gut on this, and you quickly make that decision? Yeah. Now, there is some science that says those are not bad decisions. But then there are some things that you just can't get a great result if you go on gut. It requires you to use a different part of your brain. Gut decisions are based on the limbic brain, which, if you like, is more like the reptilian part of your brain, which is good at fast processing and works sometimes. But increasingly, the kind of jobs we have, and I would argue particularly for your own jobs that are complex, and you've got to think of human behavior and how people will respond, we need to make the kind of decisions that are processed in our prefrontal cortex, this part of our brain. Now, there's something to know about those decisions, which is they require an enormous amount of effort. And for most of us, after a while of using our prefrontal cortex, we get tired and we tend to make decisions without fully processing the issue. So fast decisions for complicated issues turns out to be inferior decisions. Make sense? Okay, so let's look at the impact of exercise. Here is initiation time, which is how long people think for in a complicated prefrontal cortex way before they actually decide on an outcome. And we're comparing control groups, which are people who are not exercising, with those who do. And before, they're roughly similar, but you'll notice that afterwards, immediately after exercising and for the next hour, people in the control group make faster decisions. Now, unless you're careful in understanding this, you might think that's a good thing. I just explained that prefrontal cortex decisions that are made quickly are usually people giving up and making inferior decisions, and that's in fact what was seen in the study. So the result I want you to focus on is people who exercise for the next hour will spend more time and effort processing complicated issues, take a little longer to make decisions, but they'll make superior ones as a result. And if your people, and yourself included, have jobs where good decisions matter, this kind of brain stamina is a boost to quality decisions. So far, so clear? Do I need to make you do more exercise? Not yet. It's coming soon. I would hate the men to misinterpret this slide, so men, don't carefully at this. But this is a graph that tells you about who's got most to gain in terms of cognitive performance, men or women, and what age group. And it turns out the leading categories of people for whom exercise boosts brain function most is people in the older age ranges, so 50 plus. It in fact increases in all the age ranges from 20. Why do you think that's going on? Why do you think exercise makes more difference to cognitive performance the older we get? Yeah, partly because if you have a lifetime of not exercising, it catches up with you. Partly because the younger you are, the more likely you are to be active in the first place. And there's a significant difference for males and females. In part, this is a little bit skewed by occupation, because disproportionately men have jobs that involve manual labor versus women, and that skews it a little bit. But it is still interesting to note that in our country, the biggest single employed population is A, the millennials, and B, the boomers, and many plus, and they have all this wealth of experience and knowledge and history of our companies, and with a little bit of exercise, all of that gets unlocked. And some of us are in that category, so it's near and dear to us. Some of you are on your way there. So far, so clear. We're talking about brain function, and now I want to talk about error rates. I showed you a little bit of that before. And when it comes to error rates, what this research says is people who make an error but who have exercised make more careful decisions or think more carefully as a result. So let me explain that. People make mistakes all the time. And generally when people make mistakes, they just move on and make more mistakes. That's how things typically go in companies. People who are exercising, when they make a mistake, pause, reflect, engage their prefrontal cortex, and spend more time thinking about it before committing another error or before another act. And that really counts if you've got someone who's in a high danger job, like an airline pilot or a nurse or in oil and gas, and you really can't afford errors. When small errors, they tend to cause other errors downstream. If you look at most of the major things like the 3 Mile Island nuclear fallout, it was a series of small errors that compounded one after the other. And if you're in that kind of industry with this knock-on effect or the domino effect is real, it really counts that your people are exercising because they will stop after an error, think, be more careful before acting again. And of course, it gives people the opportunity to just avoid errors in the first place. People who exercise make fewer errors, period. So again, by a show of hands, whose occupation in the companies that you work for are ones where errors count? And can you try and put a financial figure on the cost of these errors? Have you ever tried to quantify them? I'd like you to spend a moment now, if you can, just scribble in your books, if you can, think about what is one error that someone in my company could make? And if they do, it had to have a financial cost. And roughly estimate what that financial cost is. You might say, well, we may lose the client and it's only a $5 sale, no big deal. Or we may lose the client and it's a $100,000 client. So take a moment and write down that figure. You don't have to be expert at it. It doesn't have to be accurate. It just has to be your best guess. Everyone got that number? Divide the number by 5. So take 20% of it or 1/5 of it. Everyone done that math? You should be really good at math after this exercise. And now multiply that number by the number of people that work in your organization. Okay, how much did you get? 200 million. Awesome. I promise I didn't know you. Okay, $200 million. Can anyone beat $200 million? No. Show of hands, whose number is bigger than $100,000? Okay. More than $1 million? Got it. What do you think the cost is of having your entire organization do 2 minutes of exercise every 2 hours throughout the day in comparison? Negligible, right? In fact, if you see all the other benefits, you might look at it as an investment rather than a cost. And I wanted you to get a sense of just how costly errors can be. And even though you made it up, and it may not be 200 million, it might be 100 million, it might be only 1 million, it's still a significant cost to our businesses. But here's what's to notice. It doesn't show up on any income statement until and unless you lose a client over it or you get sued for it. Mostly these errors are costing us and they're not visible to leaders and managers. And that's one of the many reasons why wellness doesn't get the kind of support from senior leadership that we'd like it to. Because higher healthcare costs, it's just one tiny problem. Most researchers estimate that the indirect costs of poor health are 3 or 4 times greater than the direct costs. So if you're worried about the high costs of health insurance in the state, and you should be, consider that 3 or 4 times that amount is the price we're paying for the poor health and poor health habits of our teams. So now let's talk about stamina. You should be starting to see some kind of pattern here. What do you think is coming next? Exercise. So this time I'm going to allow you to sit, but we're going to do a stamina exercise. And I think we'll do this side of the table, this side of the room versus this side again. Here's how it works. Stay seated in your chair. And all you have to do is get comfortable and then lift both feet in front of you. When I tell you, don't start early. So move your chair so that you don't start early. And here's what we're going to do. When I tell you to start, out and hold them up. If at any point your feet touch the ground again, you're out. You're done. Person or group of people has their feet up. Ready? Yes? Does anyone think this is a little lame and you want to do something tougher? You sure? Because we can do floor planks too if you want. No? Okay, go. If you're holding the side of your chair, you may be cheating. Put your hands up. Awesome. Easy so far? Yeah, I forgot about the shoe disadvantage. If you got boots on, I'll spot you 5 seconds. People have told me that residents of Anchorage are quite competitive. Is that true? We're at 30 seconds if you're counting. If you can, shout out where you're feeling pain, if anywhere. Quads. Thumbs. I noticed the hands have dropped quite a lot. It's okay. Okay, we're going to do 30 more seconds. Now, although you may be feeling it in your quads, the purpose of doing this, which is something you can do at your desks every hour if you want to do, or every 20 minutes, is your heart rate is now being elevated as your quads go to work, stabilizing your body and keeping your legs up. And why I care is because it's moving more blood to your brain. 10, 9, has anyone dropped their legs yet, or has everyone still got them up? Okay. It's a pretty good audience. We should have done planks, Scott. There is still time. Okay, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you. Now, although that may leave you feeling a little tired in the legs, here's some of the impact. And again, what we did now is a sufficient dose. If you're doing something every hour on the hour, you just did enough to get some of these benefits. And this looks at 3 aspects of mental stamina, which is for how long you can concentrate, the amount of errors you make when you're speaking, and how much you can really pay attention, what's called increased interest. So curiosity, focus. It's related to concentration, but a slightly different parameter. And you'll notice the difference between those people who exercise in the hour or 2 following versus those people who don't. Significantly better, 15 to 20% increases, just from that little dose that you did now. And last but not least, I want to look at the category of total performance. And this time, I'm going to give you a break and not have you do another exercise. But if you look at this graph, it maps out VO2 max. Does anyone know what VO2 max is? It's the volume of oxygen, the maximum volume of oxygen that your cardiovascular system can process under exercise. And why it's called the max is you get on a treadmill and someone puts a mask on your face and they measure how much oxygen you breathe in, your body processes and sends to your muscles. It's a measure of fitness. So it's a fancy way of saying how many flights of stairs can you climb without being out of breath. And what this shows is how that relates to workability index, which is a whole series of questions that people are asked about how much they feel like they can work, their stamina, their output, the quality of the work they do. It's quite a rich index. And what this shows is that for people that exercise over time, workability continues to increase as fitness increases. So these 2 minutes of exercises that we're doing, well, they're not going to really make you fit. They will give you the short-term brain improvement, and they will give you the error reduction and the memory retention during the day. But there is a benefit to doing a little bit over and beyond that, and that benefit increases over time. And this, more than anything else, is why the older we get, the more we have to benefit from exercise. It has a cumulative positive effect on our performance. Now, I'm hoping what we've shared with you so far this morning gives you more than enough statistics and data to share with your teams back at the office and to share with your leadership in the hope of having them come to terms with this one overall statistic, which is if you have 10 people working on any job in any company who don't exercise, they will be as productive as 9 people who do. So if you're carrying a workforce of 100 or 200 or 300 people, for every 10 people, you're carrying somebody extra because of the lack of exercise of the group as a whole. That's a pretty significant thing to look at. That's just in terms of output. We're not even measuring the error rate reduction or the stamina. This is just units per man hour. So in the next 2 slides, I'm going to summarize for you, and you've got this in your notes, all of the value that we've looked at today. 30 to 45 minutes of exercise, even moderate exercise, will improve the quality of people's thought and decision making. Just 6 minutes, which is a little bit more than we did now in these exercises we did, leads to faster learning. So next time you're doing training or you're trying to enroll people in your 401k, the first thing you should do before you give them a complicated subject like should you plan for your retirement is have them do 2 or 3 minutes of exercise. Cognitive benefits improve steadily from the day you start exercising up to that first 6 months and then maintain. So there is a benefit to creating this habit over time. And 2.5 hours of exercise during the work reduces, to exercise during work hours increases that units per man hour. That was the 10% statistic I just shared with you. 10% of exercise during the day improves stamina in the quarter of a population who are the least fit or the least active. And last but not least, fitness correlates with end-of-day fatigue ratings. So particularly if you have nurses or other people who have these long shifts, 7 to 12 hours long, exercise during that shift more than anything else will produce the stamina to sustain that shift or that energy level during the shift. Now, there's one thing to tell you about all of what I've shared so far. It's a lot of statistics and graphs, which are great, but there is something you can take as basically a rule in the science of influence, which is that data and statistics and graphs have never changed anyone's mind in the history of the world. What changes people's minds is stories. If we are really convinced of something and someone brings data that disputes that, we discount it, we argue against it, and in fact strengthens our positions. Have you noticed how polarized we are politically as a country today? The one side is not going to convince the other side that they're right and vice versa, because most of the argument is based on facts and data. So although I know that these facts matter and the data matters, my challenge to you is to take what you've learned this morning and wrap it in stories or case studies or add a little bit of emotion, because that's what it'll take to change people. And particularly when you're enrolling your employees in your wellness programs, if you say, your brain will work better and you can last longer, what they're going to hear is, oh, so you're doing this just so you can get more out of me? And the truth is, yes, we are. But you may want to enroll them in the benefits that exercise has in other areas of their life, what it can do for them as family members or as parents of their kids, particularly if they role model these kind of habits for their children. So we're going to look at that just a little bit more deeply now. Scott's going to take over for us a moment or two before we have a break. And during the break, we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes. Coffee and tea are available there and outside, but I implore you to take time for a little bit of a walk as well before we get on to the second section. Scott.
Hi, everyone. Is this thing working? Yeah, okay. So really quickly, I wanted to share one last piece of information on this relationship between how we move our bodies and how our minds work. And this is something that I just stumbled across recently as a result of getting to work with some school districts in the state of Washington on their wellness programs. So it occurred to me as interesting that given the fact that students are measured, should be talking into that, given the fact that students are measured in class pretty much all the time, and that we could evaluate their performance pretty rigorously over time, might there be somewhere out there some evidence suggesting that if students exercise, that their performance on tests, that their grades and academic performance in general improves? Sure enough, with just a cursory search for information on this, I discovered that there's a mountain of evidence suggesting that more or less, if we simply have school students practice running the mile, before they go to class each day, and particularly before their most critical classes, their performance improves significantly. And not only that, but they tend to behave better. Their mood improves, and the environment in the classroom is going to be more conducive to learning. And there's tons of data suggesting this. But what's remarkable to me is that despite the existence of that data, we exist at a time where science is sort of telling us how things could and should be, but we have not yet caught up to it in terms of how we're operating in our schools and also in our workplaces. So I wanted to share that. And then there's one last thing before I ask us to stand up, and we're going to do one more exercise. Excuse me, on your tables, there's a little sign, and you're probably wondering what it means. It asks, have you had your brain-derived neurotrophic factor today? Brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, is again something I stumbled onto recently. It's become sort of an inside joke at Vivacity. BDNF is a protein. It's a silly little protein that, as the name suggests, it comes from our brains. It has a tendency to pool up in the gaps between our brain cells, between our synapses, or in our synapses. And it just sort of waits there. And what does it wait for? It's waiting for us to exercise. Strangely, this stuff pools up and waits for us to move our bodies, and when we do, it disperses into our brains. And when that happens, and we know this because it's been done in laboratories, our brain cells actually grow and expand and connect to one another in novel ways. And that expansion, that growth, is the physical foundation for learning. It sort of explains a lot of what Andrew has shown us today and exactly how it works.